Today, I would like to talk with you about Swami Sarvapriyananda's short ebook, Who Am I? In fact, this video will be entitled An Introduction to Vedanta by way of Swami Sarvapriyananda's Who Am I? You may or may not know that Swami Sarvapriyananda is the minister at the Vedanta Society of New York and has been so since 2017. In fact, many of his talks and videos have been widely viewed by people interested in Advaita Vedanta. So we might ask firstly, what is Vedanta? A brief summary statement would suggest that it is the metaphysical doctrine as well as the path of spiritual realization that is everywhere in evidence in the books termed the Upanishads, the sacred literature of these various seers or rishis. For my part, I'm not going to go through the various arguments in detail, the ones that Swami Sarvapriyananda makes. Instead, I would like to treat this as an introduction to Vedanta. There was a wonderful lecture series I listened to back in the 90s by J.M. Bernstein, philosophy professor now at this New School for Social Research in New York City. He was discussing Hegel's phenomenology of spirit, and he said, by the end of this course, I just want to allow you to be able to open the book. I was privileged enough to take a course with him. I audited it in New York City back in 2009, and it did feel as if the sensitivity of the lectures was what enabled us to open the book, perhaps after the course was over. My hope is that I'll be able to do that today with you by going through some of the key features and evidence in Advaita Vedanta. Now, in this case, we have a commentary on the Mandukya Upanishads, in particular, an exposition of the seventh mantra or seventh verse. Let me read that first, and then I will begin to sketch a map, if you will. This is the translation we find in the text and lecture Who Am I by Swami Sarvapriyananda, quoting, "The capital S self is not the dreamer, not the waker, not an in-between state, not the deep sleeper, not the all-knower, and not the unconscious. The self is invisible, not transactable, not graspable, cannot be inferred beyond thought and beyond language. It is the essence of the I sense, the quiescence of the universe, peace itself, bliss itself, non-dual and thought to be the fourth, or turiya. This is the self to be realized." End quote. I will be just taking us through a little bit of that quote, a small part of the argument. Before I do so, however, I'd like to try to see what motivates us to come to this teaching in the first place. What could have brought me, let alone you, dear viewer, to this particular place? Or what might bring you right here to this particular place? In other words, what actually gives rise to the doubt or to the question, who am I? I want to suggest, so this is a reconstruction of sorts, that we find ourselves in a particular existential conundrum. And that could be defined or marked by finitude or by human finitude. I begin with certain existential questions at a particular point in my life. The first one is very commonplace, namely, how can I get rid of all of my suffering? Why am I suffering so much? And how am I to get rid of it? It will be clear to you that this turns out to be not quite the right question. And yet, it's a very powerful existential question. Therefore, there comes to be a certain revision that you make at some point. And that brings me to the second formulation. I borrow this term error message from the contemporary scientist Donald Hoffman. Which error message is dukkha, or suffering revealing? In the first formulation, I was just trying to get rid of my suffering. How to was the question I was asking. Now I start to be more open-minded. I wonder, what is it that isn't understood in connection with my misery, my sorrows, my dissatisfactions? What is this trying to say to me? We're getting closer to the mark. At some point, I begin to place the accent mark more on my own nature, on the I, on myself. So I come to a third formulation. I'm no longer just interested in what the suffering is trying to tell me. I'm interested in who this me that's being indicated, or the me that appears to be suffering, is in the first place. And something really starts to stand out. That is, I seem to take myself to be a finite or limited being. I'm small, vulnerable, or fragile. And all that is around me is strange and great, possibly alienating. The universe is opaque. Others are behind some kind of veil. I feel separate and, once more, small. And therefore, I start to ask the question, is it true that I actually am a finite being? I feel limited. I feel enclosed. I feel localized, fragile once more, and vulnerable. I'm that which is subject to this suffering. But the twist comes. I start to be open to the possibility that that particular description of the human condition may not be true. So finally, a question arises, is it true that I am a finite or limited being? Now we're getting very, very close to what motivates the question, who am I? Because this openness to possibility is starting to generate a sense of doubt or wonderment. That is, if I'm not perhaps a finite or limited being, then who or what am I? In essence, this particular series of questions, which looks something like a line of inquiry, begins slowly but surely to move its emphasis from such and such is happening, how do I get rid of such and such, to something is opening up in me. There's something here that's about me. There's something about the nature of myself that is now being brought into question. Once the accent mark falls more and more on the subject pole and less on the object pole, I can then ask the question out of doubt or wonderment, well, what am I then? Or who am I after all? I would call that our existential conundrum. And all of this is, I would argue, behind what brings us to an Indian philosophy and religion like Advaita Vedanta. Well, that brings us to the second basic remarks that I'd like to make. Once we have a really keen sense of why we might even ask the question, who am I, in the first place, then we might be puzzled at the way in which Advaita Vedanta proceeds, particularly in the Mandukya Upanishad. We're going to hear about the waking state, the dream state, and deep sleep. The question here is, why this methodology? Why would we ever be interested in not the content of our dreams, but something about the nature of the dream state? Why would we be interested in deep sleep, about which we seem to know almost nothing? Why are these arguments, once we read these texts, occurring over and over again? So we need to understand something about the methodology, because it can certainly seem off-putting or curious, but without any real relevance or traction. So why are these brought up so much in Advaita Vedanta? Therefore, the question is, why draw on this particular methodology? Now, there are two methodologies, but we won't come to the second one during this particular video. The first one, again, pertains to the three states arguments, 3 or 4 states. And the second one will be an appeal to direct experiences. I'll be speaking more about that in due course in a separate video. I would argue that there are a number of reasons why the 3 states arguments are employed over and over again. The first argument is actually very simple. We need to get buy-in, or the teaching needs to get buy-in from the student or the interlocutor, or indeed, in this case, from you. You can't deny, if we speak in fairly ordinary language for the moment, that we're now in the waking state. Generally speaking, if we don't get too philosophical yet, you don't have any doubts about that. Nor would you ever deny that you have dreams every night. You might be less certain about the nature of deep sleep, but there are arguments that Advaita Vedanta will seek to marshal here in order to draw out what actually is the case. So the first reason that this method is employed is that there's no trouble with skeptical doubt. The mind can't hem and haw about the fact that, yes, we're in the waking state right now. So we can start to get the teaching to move, to show us something in virtue of appealing to what is commonly shared by all beings. The second reason I would give is that it's parsimonious. And that is a term I'm borrowing from the contemporary philosopher Bernard Kastrup. Though he tends to use it in connection with theories and explanations, here I'm using it in a slightly different sense. That is, you're actually drawing from a very limited data set consisting of 3 or 4 kinds of experiences, with a view to generating various creative possibilities. In other words, with a view to allowing all sorts of arguments to unfold that will reveal to us these high truths. There's something quite elegant and simple about being able to use a very limited fund, and in consequence, being able to draw pretty exceptional and extraordinary conclusions therefrom. The third one, in connection with the first and second, I would call inquiry flexibility or inquiry traction. As for traction, we need something that we can begin with so that we can inquire in order to reveal the truth of the matter. So if you and I were to have a philosophical conversation, I might ask you a very basic question such as, right now, what is that to which you are alive? That question would allow for a thought to be generated. You would say, I'm very alive to my creative power. That's a thought. And that thought becomes a direct experience that can enable us to inquire together. I can then ask you, what is it in particular about your creative power that is that to which you're alive? And you will say, I'm feeling that there's a great block right now. Another thought to which I can reply, why is that? Etc. Notice that the first question generated a thought, then another thought was generated in the form of a question. Now we can begin to get an inquiry going that could reveal something quite deep. Likewise, Advaita Vedanta is using stock examples that can allow for the inquiry to take off. You could say that this small data set is a little bit like a tarmac. We need the tarmac in place in order for the airplane's wheels to turn and get traction so that it can finally take off. For these reasons, and for others besides, Advaita Vedanta is going to talk about these three states. It may, however, still seem odd to you, or peculiar, or ill-fitting. But as you take them up more frequently, as you hear them being mentioned from different angles of approach, there will start to be a sense of doubt. Maybe what I thought I knew, I don't actually know, a la Socrates, or a sense of wonderment. Wow, I wonder whether the sorts of things that can be said about the dream state could also be said about the waking state, with the consequence that I'm epistemically uncertain about whether I could be the dreamer or the waker. Then who am I? All right, from here then I want to turn to what I think is one prakriya, one main line of inquiry that is followed in Advaita Vedanta, and we'll see it in Swami Sarvapriyananda's text, though he sprinkles it in a certain way. I would suggest that you commonly see three steps followed in a number of these Vedantic teachings. The first step is typically called viveka, or the path of discrimination, or the path of exclusion. It states variously that the subject is not the object. The seer is not the seen. The witness is not the witnessed. The knower is not the known. Why would it do that? I would suggest that, remember, we're starting to become interested in the question of who I am or what I am. So we need some way of beginning to understand the nature of my being. The implication here, or the assumption, is that the reason we can't get clear about the nature of my being is that there's a certain kind of jumbled together mixture of an I and a this, of I and experience. I am alone, or I am the doer, etc. If that is the correct diagnosis, then what Advaita Vedanta first offers is what I would call an unmixing or a disentangling. So I'm going to begin provisionally and temporarily as a technique, as an upaya, to separate the nature of my being from the experiences that happen to be rising and falling just now, such as thoughts, feelings, sensations, and perceptions. When I pull them apart, I discover something. In fact, I discover, for example, that I'm not the body, the mind, or the senses through a searching inquiry that reveals that all of these are seen or known by me. All of these are those two that appear to me. So we need to first, on this understanding, prize them apart. And secondly, once we've prized, this is called the witness teaching, once we prize them apart, we can move on to step two. That is, we can begin to ask the question, What is then the nature of this witnessing awareness? What is the nature of the awareness that I am open to? We already learned a little bit about this in the seventh mantra, or at least we heard something about it. For example, it's commonly said that, and you can inquire into this on your own, that awareness has no objective qualities. It's not seeable, it's not hearable, it's not tasteable, it's not touchable, it's not tangible. Additionally, it's not thinkable or conceivable. It's not in space, it's not in time, and so forth. Now, those were just negative assertions. But what Advaita Vedanta also offers will be studies, exercises, or meditations that reveal this in one's actual experience. Notice what we've come to so far. We've first separated the knower from the known, the seer from the seen, the witness from the witnessed. Having done that, then we turn the questions back on ourselves and begin to ask, am I visible? No, there's a representation of somebody wearing a yellow shirt just now, but that's actually a visual representation. That's actually not my invisible being, etc. We begin to learn more or to discover more about, well, Sat, Chit, Ananda. Then the third step involves the return, so to speak, of the awareness that we are to objective experiences or to states. In this case, we'll tend to ask two questions. One, what is that common element in and through all experiences and states? This is an in question. We want to know in what all experiences and states are appearing. Why? Because we're beginning to bridge the provisional gap or divide between the subject and the object. Remember, we distinguish between the two in order to understand what the nature of the subject actually is. But that's not where the teaching ends. It's, after all, non-dual or Advaita. It then needs to make a rapprochement of objective experiences so that a deeper understanding can begin to be felt. Typically, that will happen through in questions. So for a time, awareness can be likened to a space. It's not quite accurate, but this is a teaching. It's as if awareness were a vast, open, empty space. It's a space in which all thoughts, sensations, perceptions, feelings, and the like are appearing. Or it's that in which the three states are appearing. It's the fourth in which dreaming, waking, and deep sleep are all appearing. The last part of this third step goes the final mile. That is, it asks, what is it that all experiences and states are actually made of? In philosophy, this is termed material cause. And there are two common analogies employed here. Well, there are a few, but there are two in particular. The first one has to do with golden ornaments. Just as bangles and necklaces and rings are made of the same material, to wit, gold, so all experiences and states are made of the same basic thing, namely consciousness or awareness. Or, just as foam and waves are ultimately made only of water, so all objective experiences aren't actually objective, but in fact are made entirely of consciousness. So we can now begin to understand then that seventh mantra, at least to some extent. What Swami Sarvapriyananda is going to do is largely the first part of the analysis here. So I'm going to reread this quote, and then you and I will go through a very brief partial demonstration or partial meditation without practice together. I'm quoting once more from the seventh mantra. The self is not the dreamer, not the waker, not an in-between state, not the deep sleeper, not the all-knower, and not unconscious. In short, it's going to be the fourth, so-called here. The self is invisible, not transactable, not graspable, cannot be inferred, beyond thought, and beyond language. So notice that the first one is the viveka, or discrimination teaching, the first line I cited. The second one brings us into what I was calling the second step. That is an investigation of my own nature on its own terms, or in its own right, or in and of itself. The third one will reveal positive or affirmations about the very nature of our being. It states, it is the essence of the I sense, the quiescence of the universe, peace itself, Ananda, bliss itself, Ananda, non-dual, Advaita, and thought to be the fourth. Thought to be the fourth, it's a provisional label. This is the self to be realized. So, let's go through a very brief demonstration in closing that can bring out some of the flavor of this teaching. We'll simply stick with the first step, which is to say, the knower is not the known, the seer is not the seen, the witness is not the witnessed. And we'll only turn to the waking state and to the dream state. Start with the waking state. Let's suppose, as many of us have done, that we take ourself to be the waker, the one who is awake. Now, this is a very natural assumption to make. So I suggest, here's the meditation, that right now you allow an I thought to arise. Let it rise to you, and that thought will be, I am the waker. Let that thought be vivid. Let it be clear. It seems very compelling. Yet, Advaita Vedanta asks us to inquire more deeply into the matter. So now consider the question, am I aware of the rising and falling of this thought, I am the waker? Am I aware of the appearance of this thought? Check. Yes. Mind will rise later and say, yes, yes, I am aware of the rising and falling of this thought. Yet if I am aware of it, then I must be the knower, and it must be the known. I must be the witness, and it must be the witnessed. Consequently, I cannot be this I thought, however compelling it may have appeared moments before. Therefore, I cannot be the waker. The mind might object and say, how did you come to that conclusion? I would ask you to cast about and see, when do we ever find the experience of being the waker? A searching inquiry would reveal that we only ever find the experience of being the waker as a thought that arises. It will be, I am the doer, for example, I am the enjoyer, I am the samskaric-based knower, and so forth. In other words, all the senses of I that ever are actually experienced are experienced as thoughts or feelings. But I'm fundamentally the awareness that is aware of that thought or feeling. I am, in this sense, the knowing, and it is the known. Consequently, I cannot be that thought. So I cannot, once more, be the waker. But could I be the dreamer? Could I be the one dreaming? Go with a very simple experience that you often have, or sometimes have. Suppose you fell into a dream, you might say, And suppose that it was a nightmare. You wake up and you tell yourself, thank goodness, thank goodness. That wasn't really real. It was just a dream. What do we mean when we say it wasn't really real? Well, we mean that it was changeable, it came to an end. We also mean that somehow whoever I am was not implicated in that dream, in the contents of the dream. Now, take the same analysis. A thought has arisen. That was not really real. That didn't really happen to me. Well, examine the question. Who is aware of that thought? The one that said, that didn't happen to me. Aren't you aware of it? Don't you know it? Aren't you that one to which it's appearing? Yes. Therefore, you cannot be that thought either. Therefore, you cannot be the dreamer. We have this intuition. We know that we can't be the dreamer. We might not know that we can't be the waker, but both actually reveal that the same kind of inquiry discloses the very fact that we are that to which both experiences are appearing, or both states, if you want to say more generally, are arising. As a result, the understanding, however inchoate it may be right now, is that I cannot be that. Therefore, I leave you with a very natural question. If I'm not the waker, go through this more times until it's clear. And if I'm not the dreamer, then who or what am I? The natural perfume of wonderment begins to be smelled more and more and more. It's here that the Vedantic teaching really takes off, revealing its power as well as its glory. Well, thanks for taking the time to be with me today.